Good morning, American History 2 class. This is week 31 in American History 2. This week we're going to be looking at a rough timeline of the Roaring Twenties, society in America in the 1920s, Calvin Coolidge's presidency, both the first and second term, the Scopes trial, the history of flight until 1929, the Radium Girls, and the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. And we'll also take a small look at the Harlem Renaissance, but we will continue that at another date, because the Harlem Renaissance started in 1920, but it went until 1945. So, for this week's question, please make sure you've checked in on the side and said present in the comments or the live chat, whichever you can get to. And for this week's question that I want you to answer, what were some of the more common themes of the 1920s? What were some of the more common themes, like what women did, or the music, or anything like that? Just put down anything you know about common things or common themes from the 1920s. All right. Okay, first we have a rough timeline of the Roaring Twenties in America. This is some important events that happened. In 1920, we had the first census, which told how many people were living in America at the time. And then the 19th Amendment gives women the right to vote, which we've already covered. The first U.S. cross-country flight is completed. The average life expectancy has gone up by 9 years and is now 54 years of age. In 1921, the first skywriting takes place. In 1922, Reader's Digest magazine is first published, and also the first experimental car radios are developed. In 1923, neon signs are introduced. A.C. Nelson begins measuring radio audiences. The State of the Union address given by President Harding is broadcasted on the radio. Time magazine is first published. The first Disney cartoon ever made, Alice in Wonderland, is produced. And then in 1924, we have the first perms for hair are available. The Teapot Dome scandal becomes public, which we already covered. The Model T Ford is being sold for $290 a car. Can you imagine that? That's a lot different than what cars cost nowadays. In 1925, the Goodyear blimp begins sky advertising. And we're going to look at advertising a little bit further on in the lesson. And the New York Magazine is first published. Also in 1925, the Grand Ole Opry radio show begins in Nashville. The Warner Brothers begin experimenting with talkies, or movies with sound. In 1926, the Book of the Month Club begins. The first radio jingle is broadcasted, and it is for Wheaties. NBC is formed, and zippers become available. Can you believe that? Zippers weren't a thing until 1926. I like zippers when they're good zippers. Sometimes zippers are frustrating. 1927, the Radium Girls trial begins. CBS is formed. The Holland Tunnel is opened. In 1928, the first teletype machine is used. The first Disney cartoon with sound is produced, and that is the Steamboat Willie cartoon. The first television sets in the U.S. are installed in 3 homes. In 1929, the first Academy Awards are presented. Experiments begin with color television. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre occurs, and the stock market crashes, and the Great Depression begins. American society in the 1920s. Many things are changing across the country, but specifically in cities and around cities. The source of power at this time is shifting. We're leaving coal behind mostly and shifting to electricity, what you and I use nowadays. And this is a type of third industrial revolution for America. So America is becoming even more industrialized than it was before, but in a different way. Our industrialization is going to change. What we're producing is going to change. A lot of American families in the cities and the suburbs are now having electric homes. So it's important to note that the suburbs were not a place for the average American family until the 1920s. We're seeing more and more families being able to live in the suburbs, so outside of the city, and be able to commute into the city for their job. So before the suburbs were for the rich, now the suburbs are for the rich and or middle class. And these homes are mostly becoming electric homes, which means they're getting what you and I use today. They're getting light bulbs, and they're also getting toasters and washing machines and vacuum cleaners and radios. But it is important to note that rural people, farmers, most people probably in the South, did not get any electricity in their homes until the late 1930s. So it's going to be a while. Education is now mandatory until 16 or 18. It's the reason that there's that difference in ages is because it's up to the state to decide how when the children can leave. So when it is no longer mandatory for them to be in class. Only 25% will finish high school. That's a really low number. Obviously, everyone would love 100% across the country to finish some type of high school education. Of course, that realistically doesn't always happen, but we want it to happen because those people have more success going on to do other things in their life. It just gives them a bit more of a leg up than people who don't finish high school. The notable person in education at this time was Professor John Dewey, who had some ideas that are still used today. Learn by doing. Make things in the classroom have a real life practicality. Make them applicable to everyday situations. Get people doing things with their bodies and physically that apply to what they're learning, and that will help them learn. And these are all very true. And then education for life. Strive to always keep learning. So you're gonna be learning no matter if you're in the classroom or out of the classroom, and you should always want to keep learning. You should always realize that you don't know everything, and there's always opportunity to learn more. And that, of course, is still true today. We also have these Scopes trials. We will look at that in more detail later on. But note that it is a trial surrounding a teacher in a Tennessee high school. In the 1920s is a time of mass consumption. People want all the things and they want as much as they can have. Also, more things are being produced. The economy is very good for some, and that is why we see this time as a boom. However, there are others, such as farmers, who are already struggling, and this is a hint of things to come for the whole economy. So people want things, they want them now, they want them fast. They want the best thing. They want the newest thing. They want the latest thing. We still, today, kind of live in that culture of mass consumption. A lot of people want the newest thing, the latest thing, the best thing, and a new iPhone comes out. It doesn't matter if their iPhone's not working, if is having trouble or is fine. They gotta have the new iPhone. So we're still seeing that today. Obviously, we didn't see it after the 20s during the Great Depression and then during World War II, but we've kind of gotten back into that habit. Even with the recession that we had, we're still a culture of wanting things, wanting the newest, the best, the latest, the greatest. Henry Ford created the assembly line for the production of his car, but other companies are obviously going to adopt this and use this because this is a fast, efficient way to make a lot of the same thing. And it gives a lot of jobs to a lot of people because the assembly line, what happens on the assembly line is that something you're creating goes down a line and gets another piece added to it at every spot in the line. And so unskilled laborers, people without a lot of education, could be given one job, taught it rather easily, and that was their job, and that's what they did day after day, hour after hour, minute after minute, just did that one thing. So like for the car, there was one person who put on the left wheel, and that's the left front wheel, and that's what they did. Left front wheel, left front wheel. They didn't have to worry about anything else or know how anything else worked. They just had to make sure they knew how to put on the left front wheel so that it would work. Time-saving goods are being produced at this time. Things such as washing machines, vacuum cleaners. Now, they're not like the washing machine and vacuum cleaners that we have today, obviously, but they were very helpful to the people at the time and helped make things a little bit easier in the home. They started opening up time for leisure, and leisure is going to be a big thing of the 1920s, or a lot of people are going to be involved in leisure, and that basically means that they're going to be spending their time doing things other than working or doing housework if you're a woman, things like that. This was a switch from what the country had been producing. So we'd been a massive producer of oil and steel and cotton and like basic goods. And now we're switching from being a producer of those basic goods, those things that are used to make other goods, and we're actually producing those other goods. Advertising is ramping up. We're going to, again, look at advertising in more detail a little bit later on down here. But advertising hadn't been seen as a very good thing before, and now that's kind of changing because of World War I. The introduction of store credit, which people still have store credit today, and store credit, similar to credit cards, very similar things, means that people can have what they want when they want it, but at a price. So buy now, pay later. That's what this time was known as. It's a buy now, pay later. And pretty much every American in cities was living this way. So not only are people living paycheck to paycheck, but they're also accruing this debt by doing store credit. Oh, so I can take this home now and I don't have to pay you right now. I can pay you further on down the line. Let me have one of everything, two of everything. Let me take home a bunch of stuff that I might not have the money for later on because I'm not thinking about it because I don't have to pay you right now. That's a later problem. The biggest invention, though, at this time was the automobile. It's changing everything. And a lot of people in the suburbs and the cities, businessmen, pretty much anyone that's upper to middle upper class are going to own an automobile. So people are going to start driving. And that's why the suburbs grow, because they have a better means of transportation from their homes to their businesses. Even though most places only own one automobile. And now a lot of families, like if you have your mom and your dad and your mom will generally each own a car. So like that's 2 cars per adult in the household. And then if you or an older sibling is driving, you may also have a car. So like let's say you're living at home, you're old enough to drive, you have a car, both your parents each have a car, and there's just the 3 of you. That's 3 cars in one household right there. And that's pretty common nowadays, but that was not common back then. Now, a lot of times it was mostly the men who were driving. Small town grocery stores are starting to close as people could make their way down the street to larger stores very easily. Landscapes are changing drastically as the cities are expanded and the suburbs are expanded and roads are added to the land. The car is having some pushback from the religious people of America, as churches saw the car as anti-religious, because some people that owned a car would no longer go to church on Sundays, but would instead go for a Sunday drive. The car also changed the way that young people, people of your age, interacted. So like teenagers to early 20s. Before this time, dating wasn't dating. It was more courting. You had a chaperone. You weren't allowed alone because inappropriate things could happen, and that's not good. And with the car, young adults were able to come pick up a friend, and then they'd go off with their friend without a chaperone, and then things could happen. That's going to be a massive issue that a lot of more conservative people have with cars for quite a while, actually. It won't be until, I guess the 60s, maybe? That kind of relaxes, that people's concern about that and worry about that relaxes. The 1920s were also all about consumerism. However, this was a big switch from the way people had lived before. So to get people to make this switch, their values and desires and expectations for their life had to change. This change was happening most notably in the 1920s with women. So obviously we've seen a big change with women, with them getting the right to vote. But now they're also getting jobs, and they're getting decently paying jobs that have regulations on how long they can work and how much they can work and how much they have to earn, all thanks to the government. They're also getting more education, and they were starting to pursue higher education. And they're getting involved in sports that women had never been able to play before. One woman swam the English Channel. They're wearing looser and shorter clothing, so their dresses become baggy, no more corsets. And the dresses shorten, so they're coming up to the knee, and they're very loose. You don't see much of a womanly figure at this time, because the dresses kind of just hang on their bodies. They were drinking and smoking and dancing freely to fast music, so we're getting a lot of... that's the flapper, basically, of what we picture when we picture the 1920s. A lot of people picture flappers. Girls with short bobbed hair that are wearing makeup, that have a cigarette, that have a bathtub gin in the other hand, that are dancing to Charleston. And that is pretty accurate to a certain degree. The fringe, not so much. But other things, like the very baggy clothing, no defined waistline, those are all very true. And that hairstyle that women wore that shortened their hair to is known as a bob. So we've got women doing all these crazy things, especially young women in the cities and the suburbs. And that's kind of concerning people, because they're seeing that as immoral. So that's just another thing added to the list that the fundamentalists, the Protestants, people of high religious values are concerned about. The country's views on advertising in the U.S. had changed as well. This was mainly due to World War I, as I had mentioned earlier. Before the war, advertising had only been for snake oil salesmen, men of bad reputations, men who were scamming people. But after World War I, where advertisements were used for good things to promote the population to support the war and to kind of make the Germans look bad, and they had a rousing success, then advertising moved towards being accepted and being widely used. So more and more companies start to use more and more advertising. And this advertising tends to be especially geared towards women. And not because of whatever sexist reason you might be thinking, but because women were the ones doing the most buying at the time. And a lot of things being made in America were made to make doing things around the house easier, which was generally just something that women tended to do more than men. So things like washing machines, vacuum cleaners, toasters, all those sorts of things were things that women would want. And so the advertising was geared towards women. But there was advertising geared towards men. For example, there was a soap that had a woman like refusing to dance with a man because he smelled bad. So get the Lifebuoy soap. So the companies paid a lot of attention to what their market was and advertised towards their market. Things that started making advertising easier on a mass scale and making advertising more of an appealing option were things such as radio. So you could have jingles now that people would remember and make them think about your product. Or during a radio show, you could put out an advertisement for your product, but also magazines. More and more magazines are starting to be made, and so in those magazines they would put advertisements in those to help pay for the magazine, but also to get products before people's eyes. The main theme of advertising is have the perfect life, find love, be like Clara Bow, the famous movie stars or other celebrities, because celebrities are a thing that's starting to happen now too. And so advertising back then was very similar to what we see now. Advertising in that way hasn't really changed much. Bruce Barton wrote a book, The Man Nobody Knows, which talked about Jesus and how he spread the faith, and that was a very good advertising game, and companies should learn from that. So along with advertising, this was the age of celebrities. So before this time, there had never truly been celebrities like there are today. There had been household names, like names that people knew, but there weren't celebrities like we think of when we think of celebrities. And that's going to actually start happening in the 1920s. People are wanting to know what the celebrities are doing when they're not doing whatever they're known for, what they're wearing. They want to emulate the celebrities, very much like a lot of people do now with celebrities today. Some of these people that were celebrities from the movies, we've got Clara Bow, Charlie Chaplin, Joan Crawford, Rudolph Valentino, and John Gilbert. Rudolph Valentino and John Gilbert were known for making women swoon for their smoldering gaze. And of course, Charlie Chaplin is known for his kind of silly ways about him, but also for thumbing his nose at society and strict rules from the time. Clara Bow and Joan Crawford were flapper girls, wore makeup, drank, smoked, and several times were the heroine of their own story. You know, they went out and got what they wanted and took charge of their own life. And so we're going to see a lot of people emulating these styles that are being portrayed for them in movies. Other celebrities were George H. Babe Ruth, and that was, if you don't know, a famous baseball star. Jack Dempsey and John Tunney, and those were boxers. Boxing was the thing at this time. Bill Tilden with tennis, and Bobby Jones with golf. So movies, massive part of the 1920s as well, as I've mentioned before, and very much influenced the way young people dressed, thought, acted, and what they believed. And this massive influence on the youth of America is actually what will prompt the second Red Scare that we're going to talk about when we get into like the 50s, 40s, 50s. The movies brought the ideas of finding love, taking what you wanted, women getting what they wanted in the end, and the women heroine to the average everyday person. Movies mocked old ideas such as women being gentle, pure, calm creatures. They also mocked the idea of class distinctions, and at this time, well, even up to this time, class distinction was a very important factor even in America. There were clear class distinctions, and the movies are kind of helping to erase to a certain degree those class distinctions, and they won't be as prominent. In the 1920s, even small towns had movie theaters, and young people would spend a great deal of time there, often picking up their ways their favorite movie stars behaved and moved, and they would copy their behavior and their movements and the way they talked and what they did and what they wore. So very much star worship and copying there. The movies were very disliked by church and traditionalists, as a lot of the movies had, at the time, very risque behavior, very inappropriate behavior. As you can obviously imagine, that was not well liked by the church. Movies were not the only new thing, as sports grew and became more profitable. So we had sports before now, but they're growing and they're getting more profitable, and we're actually going to see a new sport in the 1920s, which was professional football. Up to that point, we had college football, but not professional. And so, like we saw on the last slide, some of the celebrities from the last slide were sports celebrities. In 1926, the largest sporting event to ever happen in America at this time, up till now, occurred in Philadelphia. This was a boxing match between Jack Dempsey and Gene Tunney for the heavyweight championship of the world. This match was also a bit of a fight for the different sides of America. Jack Dempsey came from the West and was a Protestant, while Gene Tunney was an Irish Catholic from New York. While Tunney came out victorious from the fight, Dempsey was still a favorite boxer of most of America. There were other sports and sports stars such as Tilden in tennis and Jones in golf. College football also became bigger, due in part to the galloping ghost, Red Grange, who was apparently very, very fast. And then the professional football was established. Partially due to Red Grange and how he made college football more profitable. Other events created stars such as Lindbergh's flight across the Atlantic Ocean, and we will look more closely at that when we get to the part of this lesson that's about flight. Another new thing to the 1920s in America was the idea of leisure time. Time where you weren't working or doing housework or working out in the farm or tending to a field or learning something. A time to just have fun, to do whatever you wanted to do. To go on vacation. That was a new concept for a lot of Americans, having only been for the very rich. And the nightlife was a new thing at this time too. I say nightclub, it's not like nightclubs today, obviously. I mean, they played music, and sometimes there was dancing, and of course there were speakeasies. But there were also reputable, law-abiding clubs, such as the Cotton Club, where you went and you just had a nice night. And that was a rather new thing at this time. People didn't do much at night, they went to bed so they could get up in the morning and do their job. But now we're starting to see people have the ability and want to spend time outside the home, doing other things, having fun. Music in the 1920s was also massively changing. There were two new forms of music. The main new form was jazz. Jazz is known as the music of the 1920s. It was loud and fast music. I'll put a link in the description so you can go listen to some 1920s jazz music if you'd like. Jazz originated from the African Americans living in New Orleans. However, white musicians did pick up the music and help to spread it. And also, it spread throughout the black community by going up the Mississippi and then into Harlem, New York. Jazz music did. But the other big type of music in the 1920s was the blues. Again, the blues started in the African American communities in America, but soon spread to other communities. A massive player in spreading this music was the radio, but also records. Those were big things at this time. And the new styles of music brought along new styles of dancing, such as the Lindy Hop, shag, the Charleston. I'll also have links in the description if I can find any of those dances, so you can go see what those look like. They're very fun and very fast-paced. You probably know what the Charleston looks like already, or have seen examples of it, but the shag and the Lindy Hop are a little bit more obscure. Changes were happening with the African American people too. Harlem, New York, became the biggest African American community in America and became the starting point for the Harlem Renaissance. So, there are two sides to the Harlem Renaissance. There's the Harlem Renaissance side that was a movement within the people and the African Americans standing up for themselves and their own growth. And then there was the Harlem Renaissance in relation to an art style and a flourishing of African American art, music, writing. That we're going to look at in more detail later on, because the Harlem Renaissance goes from 1920 until around 1945. So we'll have plenty of time to look at that on another lesson. But we are going to take a quick look at it today, just so you can kind of see some stuff that was going on with it. Marcus Garvey and his Universal Negro Improvement Association started the Harlem Renaissance in terms of new strides for black people, not in terms of the artistic movement. Marcus Garvey advocated for racial pride, economic independence, strong education, and self-rule. He created an African Orthodox church where African Americans could look to a black Christ and a black Virgin Mary. And he also created groups for African Americans such as the Black Cross Nurses and the Black Eagle Flying Corps. So we're seeing African Americans start to develop their own sense of self, starting to get some independence, starting to speak out against Jim Crow laws, starting to speak out against their treatment, and starting to come up with their own art styles and really enjoy having their own style of living, their own style of art. And we're going to see white people appreciate their art, but still not really appreciate the people creating the art. The Harlem Renaissance. The main staple of the Harlem Renaissance as far as artistic movement are the writers, musicians, and artists that come out of the Harlem. And when you look up Harlem Renaissance, you're going to see a bit more about the artistic movement, most likely, than you will about the movement of the people. But both were very equally important. Some such creative minds include Duke Ellington, Bessie Smith, Jacob Lawrence. There are others. There was even a black musical in the 1920s called Shuffle Along. The art you see before you is by Jacob Lawrence. On the left, you have The Migration of the Negro, Panel 3, and then on the right, you have To Preserve Their Freedom. And that kind of block, almost Cubanism-looking art style started with the Harlem Renaissance and is really apparent in a lot of their art. That's not to say, obviously, that African Americans were treated well or equally throughout pretty much all of the U.S. Jim Crow laws were still in place throughout all of the nation, and a lot of the new nightclubs would not let black people be patrons, although they would let the black people perform. And so people would come and they would perform. The black people would come and perform, people such as Duke Ellington and Bessie Smith, but they wouldn't be able to be in the nightclub as patrons. They wouldn't be able to be served, things like that. One such of these venues is the Cotton Club. However, African Americans were the only people having trouble at this time. Immigrants were also looked down upon quite a lot. And people of faiths different than the Protestant religion. Protestants were fearing everything going on in society with the motion pictures and the jazz music and the short skirts and the bobbed hair and the makeup and the mass consumption that all worried the Protestants, and they all felt like that was an attack on their morals and on the morals of the country, but they couldn't really do anything about it. So a lot of them turned their fear and anger and frustration and worry to immigrants and to people of different faiths than them. And we're seeing the country really divide here, even more than it was already divided. So the country's already always pretty much been divided between the North and the South. And the South, obviously, is tending to be that more Protestant, more the Bible Belt, as we call it, more religious-based. Whereas the North is more go with the flow, more industrial. We've always had the split. If you'll remember, we had the split before the Civil War. We had the split when the country first started, with the South being more farm and the North being more industrial, and the farmers seeing industrialization as bad and evil. So we're kind of having that again, just in a different way. And this is a consistent theme throughout all of American history. Not just Protestants, though, at this point were worried about the new stuff coming out of Hollywood, the new jazz music, all that new fangled stuff. People that were professionals at their craft, were masters at their craft, were worried about some things. Dance instructor Fenton T. Brought voiced a wide concern throughout America about the evil nature of jazz music and the evil nature of the dancing that came with jazz music, and how it was leading the youth of the U.S. towards sins of all types. And then we're also going to see a resurgence at this time of the Ku Klux Klan, or the Kkk. They had a massive resurgence at this time, but believe it or not all their hatred, not all their violence was directed towards African Americans. I'm not by any means saying that African Americans weren't targeted, because they were, but the Ku Klux Klan also very, very much targeted Catholics and Jews and immigrants from Europe. And it was a massive attacks on Catholics, especially from the Ku Klux Klan. They argued that the Catholics had placed their loyalty to the Pope above their loyalty to their country, or the U.S. And they argued that Jews were the only ones in motion pictures. They were dominating. They were taking up positions from deserving Americans and stealing from the American people in that manner. They argued that the immigrants from Europe and Asia were taking the jobs that Americans needed, and that they would support their homeland countries and cause riots and uprisings just like were happening in Europe. Even though a lot of reasons that immigrants were coming over here at this time were to escape the riots and uprisings. But the KKK attacked people in the 1920s, throughout the 1920s, African Americans, Catholics, Jews, immigrants, you name it, they were going at them. And they marched on Washington. They, did a march or a protest walk like you see other people do today, like you've seen people do for generations, like women did when they wanted to vote. The KKK did that as well. And then by 1933, the KKK controlled 3 state governments and claimed 5 million members. That's a lot of people. Due to this influence and the fears of even non-KKK members after World War I, the U.S. government passed several laws in the 1920s to limit immigration from Europe. So even people who didn't join the KKK were afraid of the immigrants. And you should have seen that in that video that you watched last week about the Red Scare. They were really worried about what immigrants were going to do over here. Like, were they going to cause uprisings? Were they going to cause revolts? Were they going to try to overthrow the U.S. government? Were they going to completely uproot the U.S. way of life, which was capitalism, and turn it to socialism? And these fears weren't completely unfounded, although they were more unfounded from the immigrants, because a lot of immigrants didn't come over here to cause those problems. They came over here to get away from those problems. But those people who did want to do those things did exist. And their people were also really hateful towards the Germans in Germany because of the war and everything that had happened, like all the damage that the war had caused and all the deaths that the war had caused. So that's what all that came together to help push the government to pass several laws that would limit immigration and almost completely stop it from Europe. But Mexico didn't have those regulations against it. So we do see a large surge of immigrants from Mexico that come into the Southwest and just the West in general and start working in fields and farms. And they kind of are going to help add to the issue of people not having enough jobs, which is going to lead to the economic collapse in 1929 with the Great Depression. Okay, so now we're going to look at Calvin Coolidge's first term as president. Now, we saw last week that Harding passed away while in office, so somebody had to come in and take his place. That person was the vice president, as it generally is, and that vice president was Calvin Coolidge. August 3rd, 1923, Coolidge is sworn into office in light of the death of Harding. September 15, 1933, Oklahoma is placed under martial law due to a ramp up of violence from the KKK due to poor economic conditions. December 6, 1923, Coolidge's first State of the Union address talks about lower taxes, support for prohibition, and laissez-faire government business practices. December 6, 1923, the first broadcast of the official presidential address. I think I said on the slide accidentally at the beginning that I think I said Harding, but it was Coolidge, not Harding. March 18th, 1924, Soldiers' Bonus Bill passes. House will go on to pass the Senate, only to be vetoed by Coolidge, but the veto will be overridden by Congress. May 3rd, 1924, the Pact of Annapolis between Nicaragua, Guatemala, El Salvador, and the U.S. This was an attempt to end uprisings and fights over territory. It doesn't work. May 26, 1924, new immigration law restricts most, Canadian and Mexico excluded, immigrants, including completely barring Japanese immigrants. July 1924, Republicans nominate Coolidge, Democrats nominate John W. Davis, and the Progressives nominate Robert La Follette. August 3rd, 1924, Dawes' plan about German reparations signed by the U.S., France, Britain, Italy, and Belgium. So Germany was having a hard time paying back what it owed the countries for the war, and it was getting bitter because troops from France still occupied the Rhine. So Dawes' plan kind of pulls those troops out of the Rhine and gives the Rhine to Germany for the most part, and tells Germany, hey, pay what you can, don't pay what we expect you to pay. September 18th, 1924, Marines withdraw from the Dominican Republic. And then November 4th, 1924, Coolidge is elected. So Coolidge didn't have a very long first term, and his first term's filled with him dealing with the rampant financial problems in the country and mediating tensions with other countries. And not a lot's happening other than that immigration law as far as Coolidge's impact on the common American person. Okay, then we have Calvin Coolidge's second term. The second term for Coolidge is spent trying to mitigate the effects of the KKK and deal with the continuing issues from World War I, along with issues from the other countries that the U.S. had interests, such as the South American countries and islands, such as Cuba and I want to say the Philippines and Guam? Is Guam an island? I think Guam's an island. So on March 4th, 1925, Coolidge is inaugurated. March 23rd, 1925, the Isle of Pines Treaty, which gives the Isle of Pines back to Cuba. So if you will remember the treaty that the U.S. had with Cuba, so that the U.S. troops would leave Cuba, and if you can remember the name of that, please put it in the comments. That in that we got the Isle of Pines, and due to that was a sore point between the U.S. and Cuba, and so with the Isle of Pines Treaty, we give that isle back to Cuba. May 5th, 1925, we have the Scopes trial. August 8th, 1925, the Kkk Marches on Washington, which I talked about earlier. January 27th, 1926, it is agreed that the U.S. can work with the World Court by the Senate, but they will never join it or the League of Nations. We never join the World Court, we never join the League of Nations. February 26th, 1926, the Revenue Act reducing income tax becomes law. So this is great for the average American because they get to keep more of their money, which means they get to do even more mass consumption, which is sort of good for the economy, but it's also in the long run really bad for the economy because it's going to hurt what the U.S. is bringing in. February 26, 1926. Oh, I'm sorry, I already said that. April 29th, 1926, canceling French debt from World War I. May 9th, 1926, the first successful flight over the North Pole by Richard E. Byrd and Floyd Bennett. May 10th, 1926, Marines land in Nicaragua to quiet a revolt there. May 20th, 1926, the Air Commerce Act is passed, so that is the federal government regulating the postal service in the air. So we'll talk about this when we get to flight, but air mail, is now becoming more popular and is a faster way to get post from one end of the country to the other. And this is the government trying to regulate that and regulate what can be sent and all that fun stuff. June 2nd, 1926, Congress establishes the Army Air Corps and the Distinguished Flying Cross. October 10th, 1926, Naval Depot explodes after being struck by lightning. October 25th, 1926, the Supreme Court gives the president the right to remove Congress members, overturning the 1868 Tenure of Office Act. If you'll remember, that was put in place when the president that took over for Abraham Lincoln was in office, and they didn't like him, so they weren't allowing him to remove cabinet members on his own. But that's now being overturned by the Supreme Court. February 18th, 1927, the U.S. and Canada established diplomatic relations independent of Britain. February 23rd, 1926, the Federal Radio Commission is created. Again, this is the federal government trying to regulate radio at this point, regulating what's being said over radio, regulating what music's playing, regulating what airways can be used, all that fun stuff. March 7th, 1927, the Supreme Court rules that voting restrictions in Texas are unconstitutional. So Texas had put some voting restrictions on who could vote as far as African Americans and immigrants, and those are seen as unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. May 21st, 1927, Charles Lindbergh completes the first transatlantic flight. We'll look at that when we get to flight. August 2nd, 1927, Coolidge chooses not to run for office again. August 23rd, 1927, Sacco and Vizinci are executed for their alleged 1920s murder of a factory guard. October 6th, 1927, the first talkie, The Jazz Singer, is released. Now, talkie was a movie that had words, that had speaking. Before that, movies were silent. They were silent films. There was no talking. There was just music playing as the actors acted on screen. And then their mouths might move, and then words of what they said would be displayed on the screen if you've never seen a silent movie. December 25th, 1927, conflict in Mexico's constitution when they give unlimited concessions to foreigners on lands in which they engaged in positive acts, but they soon revoke that for any oil-rich lands. So when Mexico reworked their constitution, they said, oh, if you've done positive things on land in Mexico, you have unrestricted access, pretty much. You can do what you want, and that land is almost basically yours, except we still kind of own it. They're going to take those words back for oil-rich land, so that's going to cause some tensions there. January 16th, 1928, Havana, Cuba, and several South American countries complain about the Roosevelt corollary. June 1928, Democrats nominate a Catholic, Alfred E. Smith, for president, and Republicans nominate Herbert Hoover. July 25th, 1928, the U.S. recognizes the nationalist government of China and signs a tariff treaty with them, which lowers tariffs between the U.S. and China. Kind of a bad move, because that's going to see some of our goods being transported, the manufacturing of our goods being moved over to China. August 25th, 1928, Richard Byrd flies to the South Pole and settles there to study it. He will remain there for 20 years. August 27th, 1928, the Kellogg-Briand Pact, also known as the Pact of Paris, outlaws war as a means to settle disputes. This is more symbolic than practical. It didn't really do much of anything, but yay, we all love each other right now, but this isn't going to last. And then November 6th, 1928, Hoover is elected president. Okay, next we have the Scopes trial. This trial was also known as the Monkey Trial. The trial was the state of Tennessee against the Tennessee science teacher John Scopes. Tennessee had passed a law that outlawed the teaching of evolution in state schools. Remember, Tennessee's part of the Bible Belt. They're very much Protestant. They are afraid of all these newfangled things that are a threat to their religion. So they want to make sure that modern science and the way these modern scientists are telling people that the world was created is not taught in schools. Scopes thought the law was not right, and that the children needed to know both ways that are believed that the earth could have been formed. So he thought children needed to know creation and evolution. So he taught evolution anyways, even though there was a law saying that that was illegal. So because there's a law saying that was illegal, Scopes was arrested. William Jennings Bryan, who was a president nominee, is going to represent the state in this trial. And then Clarence Darrow, the nation's most famous and best defense lawyer, is going to represent Scopes. And the first trial is going to happen at the state level, and it's going to be hard and grueling. It's hot, it's in the summer, and it's rough, and Scopes is going to be found guilty, and he's going to be fined a lot of money. But Darrow does make Bryan look like an absolute moron. And then the trial's going to go to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court's going to overturn the ruling of the state, but they're not going to really decide whether or not Scopes is guilty or innocent. They're just going to make the state repay Scopes his fine, and so the trial ends up being inconclusive, but this was a huge step for the push of modern science against Protestant beliefs, which is why we study that. Flight. So flight started in 1903 when Orville Wright got on the plane that he and his brother Wilbur Wright had created. The first flight was only 12 seconds and only covered 120 feet. And it's not like, it wasn't an airplane like we think of today. You can see an image there in front of you. Orville had to lay on his stomach and like pilot the plane with his arms, and it was a big to-do. But the first flight through the air was considered a success, and the brothers kept trying to make the planes more durable, and by 1906, they had built an airplane that could stay in the air for 30 minutes and cover nearly 25 miles. By 1914, planes were becoming a worldwide interest and would even be used in World War I to scout out enemy positions. After the war, airmail was established and got people things faster than ever. People were really starting to see the pros to airplanes as a possible means of transportation for not only goods, but for people in non-war situations in the 1920s. People started to take longer and longer flights, pushing the limits of the aircraft's abilities. And people would be known for pushing these limits. The most well-known person being Charles Lindbergh, who set a cross-country record in 1927 when he flew from California to New York. And then 10 days later, he made his famous flight as a solo pilot, flying across the Atlantic Ocean from New York to Paris, France. And this was the first flight nonstop across the Atlantic Ocean, and it was a solo flight too. So those were the big things on that. Those were the landmarking achievements there. The new independent woman was also getting involved in this fancy new means of transportation. The most notable of these being Amelia Earhart, who was the first woman to fly solo across the Atlantic. Okay, now we're moving on to the Radium Girls. On December 21st, 1898, Marie and Pierre Curie discovered the radioactive ingredient radium. They won a Nobel Prize for this discovery, and they discovered this in France. Radium was all the rage. It quickly became all the rage, and people wanted things made with radium. It was a big deal, and it was often called instant sunlight. People believed radium would make you healthier, and things such as radium tonics came out. Fortunately, radium was very expensive, and a lot of these tonics would not actually contain true radium. They would contain fake radium. They would just contain regular things, like regular non-deadly ingredients like radium is. Or it would be a very small amount of radium that people could ingest and it wouldn't kill them right off. It might give them cancer later, though. That was not the end of the use of radium, as it started being added to some toothpastes, face creams, spa waters for the rich, and then the New York Institute for Radium gave rich people radium injections. Radium was also used to fight cancer. Later, it was discovered that if you mixed radium with other substances, including zinc, you could make a pale, glowing paint. Then the U.S. entered World War I, and the need came for soldiers to be able to see their watches in the dark, especially in the dark trenches. So seeing a need for the soldiers, we see a company, U.S. Radium Corporation, enter the picture. They produced wrist watches for the military that had glowing numbers and glowing, what are those things called? Hands? Glowing watch hands, so that the soldiers could easily see what time it was in the dark trenches. But more clocks and things painted with the radium, the paint, the glowing radium paint, were desired by normal everyday people once the war was over. So the U.S. Radium Company was going to continue making these watches and making other clocks that glowed. So to answer both the needs of the military and the desires of the general public, U.S. Radium Co. hired many, many young women. It was like over 15,000 at one point, who were looking to help support their families at the time like this, and later, once the war was over, wanted to be independent and do their own thing. So they hired these women to paint the watch dials with the radium paint. The main time that they were hiring these women and the watch dials were being painted was between 1917 and 1926. The girls earned about 1.5 cents for every dial painted, which is about 17 cents today. So imagine earning 17 cents for every dial you paint. But that was good money back then, especially for factory workers. So this was considered a pretty big deal job. And also because it was believed that radium was so healthy for you, that was a perk of getting to work with the radium. The scientists were starting to see, though, that there were dangerous risks to being exposed to a lot of radium and for so long. Or too long. U.S. radium chemists had started writing up reports on the dangers. However, the girls were still told that the radium-filled paint was completely safe, and were even encouraged to use their lips and teeth and tongues to keep the brushes as fine-tipped as possible. And in the picture over to the side, you can see that's one of the Radium Girls. She was basically on her deathbed, being interviewed, giving testimony for the Radium Girls case, and she's demonstrating how they would pull the brush through their mouth, like, and twirl it in their mouth to make a nice fine point, and paint the watch dials. Since they were constantly assured that the paint was safe, for fun, the girls would also often paint their fingernails, their faces, even their teeth with the glow-in-the-dark paint, along with cover their clothes in it at times. Their everyday clothes, even though their work clothes were already covered with the dust. What either went unnoticed by the girls or was hidden from them was the fact that all the other people being exposed to the radium would do their best not to expose themselves to the stuff or get it in or on their person, often wearing protective gear such as lead aprons, lead gloves, hiding behind lead screens when working with the radium, wearing face masks so as not to breathe in any radium dust, things like that. We know now that radium will concentrate in bones and teeth, and the body will treat the element as a calcium substitute. However, radium does the opposite of strengthen the bones. It actually eats away at the bones. The watch dial painters, quickly started to develop odd medical issues that doctors could not explain. One girl, Frances Spletschlatter, developed anemia, jaw and tooth pain, and arthritic symptoms. When a dentist tried to remove one of her aching teeth, part of her jaw came away with the tooth. Soon after that, her gums and cheek rotted away, leaving a hole in her cheek. Her health continued to worsen, and she was dead within a month of having her tooth pulled. Across the country, these trends continued of girls getting ill and dying, as there were multiple factories across the country. This brings us to Grace Fryer, who in 1922 had her teeth start to loosen and then fall out. It was soon discovered that her jawbone was filled with tiny holes. More and more doctors examined Grace to try to figure out what had caused her health problems, and then other girls started to have the same issues, and it soon became clear that all the girls either currently worked or had at one point worked at the job as dial painters. When Grace was told that it might have been her job that caused her health problems, she looked for help with a specialist. So the help from a specialist came in the form of Dr. Frederick Flynn from Columbia University. After examining Grace with another colleague, both of whom claimed to be experts in the medical field, they both declared that Grace was perfectly healthy and fine. There were 3 problems with this, however. Well, there were more than 3, but there were 3 main problems with this issue. Dr. Flynn was not a medical doctor. He was not licensed to practice medicine in any way. He was also being paid by U.S. Radium. And then his colleague who examined Grace with him was the vice president of U.S. Radium. U.S. Radium was now in a panic, and they wanted to hide what was happening to the women they employed. They paid off doctors and dentists to tell the girls they were suffering from syphilis and to declare that the cause of death, if and when the girls died, was syphilis. This was a big deal back then because that meant that the girls were loose women, and that was morally shameful, and families could be shunned. Like if they had other female relatives, they could be shunned because of the syphilis, and it could be assumed that they were loose and immoral. And churches, depending on your religion, might not want to give you a proper burial. It was the whole thing. Thankfully, some of the doctors the girls saw were not willing to make false claims. They were, however, paid by U.S. Radium not to talk to the media. U.S. Radium hired Cecil Drinker to come write a report on the conditions of the U.S. Radium dial painting factory. He was not willing to be paid off and wrote a thorough report warning U.S. Radium about the dangers of radium. Dust samples collected in the workroom from various locations and from chairs not used by the workers were all luminous in the dark room. Their hair, faces, hands, arms, necks, the dresses, the underclothes, and even the corsets of the dial painters were luminous. One of the girls showed luminous spots on her legs and thighs. Another was luminous almost to the waist. That was part of his report. However, the report by Drinker was not all doom and gloom. He gave several easy ways that U.S. Radium could fix the issue facing their factories and the danger it posed to the girls. Things such as giving the girls some lead-lined aprons, or giving them a screen to work behind, making sure the girls weren't putting the tips of their brushes in their mouth, trying to contain the dust better. Very basic, simple, easy things that could have been implemented without much trouble. However, U.S. Radium completely ignored Drinker's report. And then they took the report and rewrote it to say everything was fine, and that the girls were perfectly healthy and nothing was wrong, and still listed Drinker as the writer. So they filed this report with the Business Bureau as Drinker's report, as the report that everything was okay. Very underhanded move there. In 1925, Drinker discovered what U.S. Radium had done with his report, so he tried to get his original report published to the general public, even though U.S. Radium threatened to sue him. As the media fire around U.S. Radium grew, Grace decided to try and take legal actions against the company. However, this was no easy battle with a company as large as U.S. Radium. They had a lot of money and thus had a lot of control over things. And Grace could not find a lawyer to help her with her case until 1927, when Raymond Berry agreed to take her case along with 4 other women. Those women were Edna Hussman, Catherine Schraub, Quinta MacDonald, and Albina Laris. This was only the start of the battle, as there were several hurdles the women and Barry had to overcome, such as the 2-year statute of limitations, which means that if you find malfeasance 2 years after you've left your job, you can't sue your company. But they managed to get that overturned, as the women were like, you told us everything was fine, you told us that it wasn't, you had experts, notice my quotation marks around experts in my voice, tell us that everything was okay, so we didn't seek retribution because you covered it up, basically. However, that was only one hurdle. There were other hurdles that had to be overcome, as U.S. Radium tried to delay the trial in any way that they could think of in hopes that all the women would die before an outcome could be reached. Even at one point, getting a 14-month delay instituted on the trial by the courts for summer vacations for some of their key witnesses, until public outcry shortened the delay to just a couple of months. Even with the public outrage, the trial still crawled along at a painfully slow pace. Marie Curie weighed in on the matter, stating that she wished she could help, but there is no way to destroy the substance once it has entered the human body. The women were not able to appear in court, they were not allowed to appear in court until January of 1928, and by that time none of them were even able to raise their arms to take the oath, and 2 were bedridden. Grace could not sit up without the help of a back brace and could no longer walk. After the girls' testimonies, the case was once again postponed for a few months for no good reason, even though one medical expert testified that all the girls in the case would be dead in a year from the radium poisoning. Again, the newspapers demanded for justice for the dying women. Reporter Walter Lippmann saying, to dispute whether they can live 4 months or 4 years while lawyers wrangle over technicalities is to make the case more stupendously horrible than ever. The whole thing becomes a legal nightmare when, in order to obtain justice, 5 women have to go to court and prove that they are dying, while lawyers and experts on the other side go to the newspapers to prove that they may live somewhat longer. This is a heartless proceeding. It is unmanly, unjust, and cruel. This is a case which calls not for fine-spun litigation, but for simple, quick, and direct justice. And Walter Lippmann was respected by the girls and by their attorney, Barry, because he told their story, he advocated for them without just talking about how they're dying. Unfortunately, though, the girls saw the writing on the wall and that the case would not be over before they died, most likely. So they decided to settle out of court, which U.S. Radium agreed to do. Although the judge mediating the settlement was a stockholder for U.S. Radium. Originally in the case against the company, the women had been seeking $250,000, which is about $3.4 million today. In the end, the girls agreed not to hold U.S. Radium responsible for their health problems and received a $10,000 each. So that was about $135,000 today. With U.S. Radium paying all the girls' legal and medical expenses, and they gave each of the girls $600 annually for each year the girls continued to live, which obviously was not long. Most girls only collected that 1 or 2 years, although one of the girls managed to last, 4 years before she passed. When U.S. Radium was asked about settling, they said it was not because they were not in the right, so not because they were wrong, not because they were reliable or should be held accountable for anything they did, but because the media was biased against them and they would not have been able to have received a fair trial because of the media bias. And then the president of U.S. Radium said that they employed people not able to find work because of their health conditions or mental conditions, and this kindness was turned against them, unfortunately. So, great upstanding guy and company. Despite all the denials that they were not at fault, after the lawsuit, U.S. Radium changed the conditions for the dial painters. The girls were no longer allowed to put the brushes in their mouth. It was strictly forbidden. They were also given protective measures to keep their exposure to the paint a minimum. After these simple changes, the health problems among the dial painters quickly disappeared, though some may have gotten cancer later from working with the radium at all, because that's true for some of the scientists as well. They got cancer from it too. Outraged that the simple steps that could have been taken from the beginning worked so well hurt U.S. Radium and their bottom line. Even though the girls did not get what they were asking for, they settled out of court, their fight for themselves helped set up more steps to cover workers of all types, along with make sure that all workers had ways to sue companies for dangerous business practices. So we can thank the Radium Girls that we are protected today as workers. The bodies of the dial painters are still radioactive today. If you go to the grave, like to the graveyard where they're buried, and you have a thing that measures radioactivity, it will spike massively over their graves, and they're buried in lead-lined vaults in lead-lined coffins to try to mitigate that radioactivity getting out, but it obviously doesn't work foolproof. And one woman from the dial painters that was a dial painter actually lived to be 107, but the reason she lived so long was because she had the job for a very short amount of time. She actually hated working as a dial painter. The gritty texture of the paint was too gross to her, so she wouldn't stick the brush in her mouth. And she just wasn't very good at it, so her boss encouraged her to quit, and that basically pretty much saved her life. But she did lose all her teeth very early in life and have gum problems and had cancer twice from the little bit of radium she did ingest while working the job. And it's very important that we remember the history like this. We remember these girls and we don't let them fade into obscurity. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre. This event happened in Chicago in 1929 on Valentine's Day, so February 14th. 4 men were in Chicago. 2 of them were dressed as police officers and had guns drawn, and the other 2 were dressed in suits and ties and had Thompson submachine guns. The 4 men burst into the Chicago car garage number 2122, the well-known hangout of Moran's gang. A little later, there was the sound of rapid gunfire and then silence until a little later the 2 police officers exited with 2 people at gunpoint. Those 2 people that were at gunpoint were the 2 men who hadn't been dressed as police officers that entered the building earlier. Inside the car garage lay 7 men with multiple gunshot wounds that would all die from their wounds. 6 of them were dead, 1 was dying. He would die later in the hospital. The men who had been shot had not been able to draw their guns to protect themselves from the men who had entered, so it had been very much a cold-blooded murder. The men who were dead had all been told by the 4 men who had been carrying the guns that had busted into the garage to line up against the wall, and then they were shot down. It is thought that the men with the machine guns fired a total of 70 rounds. All the dead men had a connection to Moran's gang. This is assumed to have been a hit by members of Al Capone's own gang. One of the members of Moran's gang survived long enough to be talked to by the police in the hospital, where he had 14 gunshot wounds that he was dying from. But when he was asked who did it, he responded with, "No one shot me." It is believed that the target of that day was supposed to be Moran himself, but the gang leader did not make it to the garage because he went to get a coffee when he saw a police car circling the area where the gang hangout was. The crime was never solved, and nothing but word of mouth linked Al Capone to the crime. It's still an unsolved murder case today. Alright, that's it for today's lesson. Next week we will continue on with the end of the 1920s, and then the Great Depression, and the Dust Bowl. And then probably the next week you will have another test, and that will be on what we've covered since the last test. So the end, so basically the 20s, the Roaring 20s, and the Great Depression Dust Bowl. If you have any questions, make sure to either leave them in the comments down below or send me an email. I will be sending out homework emails later today, hopefully, so keep an eye out for those. If not today, then of course sometime on in the week. It was a rough day for me because I had to get up really early because of a power outage. So I hope you all have a great week, and I hope you enjoyed this lesson, and I will see y'all sort of next week.